This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, starts today's show by discussing his recent blog article that covers various legal issues farmers and ranchers have found themselves in. Continuing the show is K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner as he reminds people about what needs to be considered before choosing and starting an estrus synchronization. The Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster conclude today's show as they converse about the average age of a herd for cattle operations from their recent Cattle Chat podcast. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show discussing legal issues farmers and ranchers are dealing with. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today talking through a few different legal issues, but the first one involving farm bankruptcy and a Chapter 12 reorganization plan.
Yeah, Shelby, this is a case from Kansas, and what it really demonstrates is that a farmer that files Chapter 12 farm bankruptcy has to have a legitimate basis for modifying that Chapter 12 plan. Now, what happens when you file a Chapter 12 is you put together a reorganization plan, which basically is telling the creditors, this is how we are proposing to restructure our business to repay our debts over a period of time. And it's subject to, of course, the bankruptcy court's supervision and the supervision of the bankruptcy trustee that is put in place. Now, you can modify that plan if your circumstances change, and you can apply to the court and request the court to let you modify the plan because there are things unforeseen that can happen where you may not be able to make the payments in accordance with the originally proposed plan. And that's what happened in this case. Some things changed, and they wanted to get that plan modified.
And for modifying that plan, was it able to go through, or did the court say no?
Well, ultimately, the court said no in this instance. They did manage to make the first annual payment to a creditor, which was a bank, but they failed to do so the next year. And so the trustee came in and filed a motion to dismiss the case late last year. And another creditor filed a motion for relief from the automatic stay that gets imposed when you file bankruptcy, which freezes the creditors in place. And creditors don't like that, obviously, so they wanted relief from that. And, of course, the debtors wanted to have that stay continue, and they wanted more time to modify their reorganization plan and make payments to the bank to avoid the bank from foreclosing on the farm. And, of course, all the creditors, the bank in particular, was objecting to that. And the court looked at this and they said, all right, you did make genuine efforts to secure financing and sell some assets to come up with funds to get current on your payments so that the foreclosure action would be forestalled. But the court said, when we look at all of the factors here, we think you have very little likelihood of success in ultimately modifying your plan in a manner that would allow you to make the modified plan payments. And so that was detrimental to them. And the court also said that you hadn't, referring to the debtors here, that you hadn't endured what the court said was a substantial change in circumstances to support modifying a reorganized Chapter 12 plan. They just had a hope, the court said, of obtaining financing on more favorable terms that would allow them to modify the plan and make payments. And they said that the court said that's not a change in circumstances, which is the bankruptcy court requirement for, and under the bankruptcy code, for modifying a plan. So you didn't have a substantial likelihood that you could pay this off, no extraordinary circumstances that would justify reimposing the automatic stay. And so they got dismissed out of Chapter 12.
Does that mean more than likely the bank is going to foreclose on their operation in this scenario?
Well, the court gave the debtors 2 weeks to avoid dismissal or show cause within 2 weeks of the court's order, or the court would dismiss the case and it would proceed probably in that instance to foreclosure.
And Roger, talking about another legal issue that farmers and ranchers could be dealing with, and this one involving the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yeah, this actually involves a branch of the USDA, which was the Rural Development Housing Service. And what you had here was an individual that got a loan from the Rural Development Housing Service of the USDA, and they repaid it in full by the middle of 2018. But the USDA, unfortunately, repeatedly informed a consumer credit reporting company that the account of this individual was past due. And so their credit score was damaged. Their ability to secure future loans at affordable rates was threatened. The individual here notified the credit reporting company that USDA had made an error, and the company in turn notified the USDA, but the USDA never corrected its records. And so the individual just, I think, probably out of frustration, threw up their hands and sued the USDA for either a negligent or a willful violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And, of course, USDA defended that by saying, well, you can't sue us. We're the big bad government. And this doctrine of sovereign immunity applies. We are the sovereign. We are not subject to lawsuits like this.
That isn't how everything worked out in the case, though, was it, Roger?
Well, ultimately, no. And this went to the U.S. Supreme Court, but initially the trial court dismissed the case. The appellate court reversed on the basis that Congress had amended the Fair Credit Reporting Act to authorize suits for damages against any person who violated the act, and that included a government agency. And so then USDA asked the U.S. Supreme Court to hear this case. The court took the case to clear up confusion between the circuit courts of appeal, because the circuit courts were all over the board on this, some holding that the Fair Credit Reporting Act does authorize suits against government agencies, other courts holding that it bars suits against government agencies. And when it gets to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court did reference that general rule on sovereign immunity, that the government is generally immune from suits that seek money damages. But they said there is an exception to that, and that is when the Congress clearly waived immunity by making a legislative statement. In other words, they wrote into the particular statute that the government can be sued for damages caused by the government's conduct. And here the court unanimously determined that Congress did that in this instance. They waived the sovereign immunity by applying its provisions to persons who furnish information to consumer reporting agencies. And so sovereign immunity did not apply in this case.
And does that have an impact on possibly things moving forward for others in agriculture?
Well, I think it does. The government is a major lender to, obviously, many farmers and ranchers, as well as people like this individual who wasn't necessarily a producer, but did obtain a loan through the Ag Rural Development Housing Service. The government, and the Supreme Court referred to that, over a third of all of the loans, and the monetary amount is huge nationwide, is from a government agency that then is lending that money under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So this decision by the Supreme Court, which, again, to emphasize, it was unanimous, I think is a major victory for borrowers in the United States because it does give them a right to redress when the government acts improperly.
Roger, our last legal issue we're going to talk about today involves a cattle ranch in Oklahoma and a pipeline leak on their property.
Yeah, this is an instance where some ranch hands noticed a diesel fuel odor coming from a cave, and the ranch hired experts to test the soil and the surface water and the groundwater for possible hydrocarbon contamination. And the test did find trace amounts of petroleum products. And so ultimately they couldn't resolve the issues in terms of the damages caused to the ranch. And so they sued the energy company, alleging claims of various torts, negligence, trespass, unjust enrichment, various types of nuisance. And the energy company moved for summary judgment on the basis that its pipeline, which was carrying gasoline and diesel fuel beneath the ranch, wasn't leaking. And in any event, the ranch owner failed to show any injury from just the small amount of hydrocarbons that were present.
However, weren't they able to take it to court and had enough evidence to prove a few of those cases?
Yeah, the trial court looked at this, and they analyzed all of the tort claims together. They lumped the negligence along with the nuisance, along with unjust enrichment, along with the trespass, and put them all in the pot, so to speak, and ultimately granted summary judgment to the energy company. Now, on appeal, however, the appellate court said, look, there are different standards of proof. There are different liability standards depending upon the tort that has been alleged. You can't just put them all in a pot to determine whether the energy company is responsible here. So the appellate court kicks this back to the trial court, saying you have to use the right evidentiary standard with respect to each particular tort. And so that's the main lesson coming out of this one. But the appellate court did affirm the trial court on the plaintiff's constructive fraud and trespass claims, saying they didn't have enough evidence with respect to those. There was no evidence that the company intended to commit a trespass or knew that its pipeline was leaking. So it's a good case in terms of how you prove your damages, what the torts are that you allege, and what the standard of care on part of, in this instance, the energy company has to be.
How did that ranch prove some of their damages?
Well, they hired experts, and that's an important point for farmers and ranchers. Make sure you prove your damages. You may have to hire expensive experts to do that, but if there's enough in controversy, that's going to be worthwhile to do that. But maintaining evidence, taking pictures, soil testing in this instance, absolutely critical to proving your case.
Roger, if people would like to read this article or other articles from you, how can they do that?
These are posted to my blog, which can be found on my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, as well as on AgManager.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about these legal issues that farmers and ranchers have faced and could face in the future.
Thank you, Shelby. My pleasure.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read his blog article on these legal issues, it is titled Farm Bankruptcy, Sovereign Immunity, Farm Lease, and Pipeline Damages. You can find it on his website, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, or on AgManager.info, or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Stick around, we're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show discussing estrus synchronization for cattle. And in to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby. Great to be on, as always.
Jason, why are we talking about estrus synchronization right now?
Well, this is a really great time for producers to be thinking about what they're going to do with the breeding season with females coming up, because here it is, the middle of March, and while a lot of folks are really right in the middle of the spring calving season, we know that quite a few producers around the country have started, or maybe they started back in January or February. And so with that, we know that just based on where the calendar is right now, we know that the breeding season is rapidly approaching for many producers around the country. And so now is always a great time to be thinking about what you're going to do from a breeding standpoint, and if you are going to implement an estrus synchronization protocol with a group of females, what that protocol is going to entail and the timeline and what your plan is going to be on that. And so it's always a great time to just be forward thinking and starting to get those plans laid out well in advance.
And there are quite a few things that producers should think through before deciding to synchronize their cattle.
Absolutely. So I think when we think about estrus synchronization, we always need to consider that it is a tool that, when it's used effectively, can be really effective at enhancing various aspects of reproduction within a group of females. And that's really, I think, the thing that we always want to consider when we think about estrus synchronization, is that it, in and of itself, is a tool. And like all the other tools that we have within our toolbox, so to speak, within our operation, we've got to use them effectively at the right time and for the right intended purpose. And so often we'll discuss estrus synchronization with an AI protocol with artificial insemination, but really estrus synchronization and artificial insemination, those are two distinct, completely separate things. And I think it's important for folks to keep in mind that we don't always necessarily have to implement artificial insemination if we use estrus synchronization. We can use natural service breeding with bulls to cover those females and breed those females and still use the benefits or gain the benefits of estrus synchronization by doing those two things together. And so it's always important for folks to keep that in mind, because there are many different situations or reasons where that might be a better fit for a producer, just depending on what their specific situation is.
What things need to be considered for the female before starting estrus synchronization?
One key thing that we always want to keep in mind is that the ability for females to respond to an estrus synchronization protocol is really dependent on a couple of things. when those females calve relative to the start of the breeding season, because we know that postpartum interval will directly affect the percentage or the proportion of those females that are cycling prior to the start of the breeding season. But then also, too, nutrition is very important when we think about body condition at calving, because we know that females that are thin, females that are body condition score 4 or less, are going to be less apt to respond to a synchronization protocol. And so we always just want to keep a couple of those things in mind, that regardless of whether we're going to use artificial insemination or natural service to breed a group of females, the ability for those females to respond to an estrus synchronization protocol is really dependent on a couple of those things there. Nutrition, want to make sure that those females are in optimal body condition and an adequate postpartum interval prior to the start of the breeding season. And so really, if females are at a body condition score 4 or less, or if those females are if they've calved within 30 days of the start of the breeding season, those are females that have a higher risk of not responding to an estrus synchronization protocol. And so we want to keep those things in mind and make sure that we're working with females that are well prepared to start the breeding season if we're going to make the effort of synchronizing them for natural service.
Jason, you mentioned protocol, and there are a few different ones that producers can choose from.
So currently, the Beef Reproductive Task Force has 4 estrus synchronization protocols that are approved right now for use with natural service. And for both cows and heifers, there's a single-shot prostaglandin protocol, as well as both a 7 and a 14-day CEDAR protocol. And again, those 3 protocols are approved for both cows and virgin heifers. And then also for virgin heifers, there's a 14-day MGA protocol approved as well, too. And so the Beef Reproductive Task Force website, which is beefrepro.org, is a great resource to go to, and we encourage folks to take a look at that. That has various details there with the timing and the implementation and what those protocols all entail. And so encourage folks to take a look at that as well. And really, I think when you think about it, our goal with estrus synchronization is we want to try to increase the proportion of those females that conceive early in the breeding season and therefore will calve early in the subsequent calving season. And that's really our goal with the synchronization protocols, to try to tighten up that breeding and subsequent calving windows, because we know that there are certain benefits there when we think about having a higher proportion of those calves that are born early during the calving season, and therefore cumulative weaning weight when those calves are weaned at a common age is greater. And then also too, if we can increase those females, the proportion of those females that are calving early in that calving season in subsequent years by giving them more additional time prior to starting the breeding season, we know that that's positive for overall conception rates as well too. And so those are really the key things that we want to think about there. But ultimately, I think whether or not it makes sense for a producer to implement either artificial insemination or just use natural service with synchronization really comes back to 3 primary factors, and those are labor. Do you have the labor resources in order to be able to accomplish those tasks? Time. And oftentimes people will talk about time and labor together, but time and labor are really 2 distinct separate resources. And then technician skill level or technician aptitude. And certainly when we think about folks, if maybe they're less familiar with artificial insemination and really haven't been through those steps before and are less comfortable with it, using estrus synchronization with natural service, just turning in bulls, can be a great way for those producers to capture the benefit, realize the benefits there of estrus synchronization, and before making the investment into doing an AI program.
For the ones that are doing natural service, are there things that they really need to think about for those bulls?
Absolutely. And so there's various things that we really want to keep in mind when we think about bull management at the start of that breeding season, if folks make the decision to synchronize a group of females and then turn bulls in. We know that there's going to be a period of heightened estrus response right during the start of that breeding season. And so it's really important for producers to really watch that cow herd very, very closely, watch those bulls very closely at the start of that breeding season, make sure that they're adequately covering and servicing females, really being very watchful for any signs of injury and making sure that if bulls do become injured during the start of that breeding season, that they're promptly removed from the cow herd, tended to, of course, and replaced with another bull if possible. We always encourage folks to make sure that they have bulls that undergo a breeding soundness exam at the well prior to the start of the breeding season. But we also want to keep in mind that just because bulls pass a breeding soundness exam doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be aggressive breeders and that they're really going to work hard to service and cover females during that breeding season. And so we would prefer to use bulls that are more aggressive during that time period to make sure that those females are adequately covered. In addition to making sure that bulls pass a breeding soundness exam and using bulls that are more aggressive in terms of how they will cover females, there is data that would suggest that fertility actually increases as bulls age, and that aged bulls or bulls that are 3, 4, 5 years of age are actually more fertile than what yearling virgin bulls are. And so generally speaking, our recommendation would be to use non-virgin bulls in a scenario where we are servicing females with natural service that are synchronized, as opposed to using virgin bulls in that scenario.
Jason, what resources can people use when thinking through these different options?
Some really good resources that I encourage folks to keep in mind. One is on ksubeef.org, our beef extension website. We have a bull versus AI cost calculator program that's an Excel spreadsheet that really does a nice job of helping folks walk through just their costs for using bulls on a set of females, and then what their equivalent costs would be for using artificial insemination. And so you can build in some costs for synchronization into both of those scenarios and help folks make a more informed decision about what their relative costs are to achieve a pregnant female between using natural service bulls or using artificial insemination. So that's a really great resource that we encourage folks to take a look at. And then also to beefrepro.org, which is the website for the Beef Reproductive Task Force. On that website, that group has several very nice resources that help break down and show the differences in the estrus synchronization protocols that are currently approved. And so the ones we've discussed here today that are approved for natural service breeding are there and they're outlined, and there's also some additional calculators and spreadsheets there that folks can use to compare different protocol costs and work through the various aspects there. Because certainly when we start comparing these different estrus synchronization protocols, there's differences there in the number of times that cattle are required to go through a chute or be handled, different labor costs, and of course the costs of synchronization protocols, the cost of the drugs that are administered as well too, and all of those things that are needed to be considered. And so lots of various things there to keep in mind, but those are some great resources that we encourage folks to take a look at. As always, anytime we're handling and working with cattle, we always suggest that folks follow BQA guidelines when administering protocols and make sure that you're working with your veterinarian and having a good, sound herd health protocol put in place for the start of the breeding season as part of just overall best general management practices to ensure breeding season success.
That was K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with another part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. This week we're joined by Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster.
Give me a ballpark for what do you think if I have commercial cows, I'm saving my own replacement heifers or raising replacement heifers. What do you think my average age of my cow herd should be?
Should be or is? I think those are two different answers.
Give me should be.
Should be, I would like the average age to be, 8 or 10 years old. I want those cows to hang around as long as possible because that's when they're actually making me money. What's it take 3 or 4 calves to actually pay off the development cost for developing that heifer?
Yeah, which may be more now because the heifer cost, we've talked about that, of development is higher. So between when she's typically 5 and 9 or 4 and 9 is kind of the sweet spot, right, of where she has good productivity, and the early years she's paying off her development costs, but then after that she's doing well. So if my herd age, if my average herd age, and you mentioned 10, and I'll pick that because it's easy math. If my average herd age is 10, then I got to replace 10% of my herd per year, right? Because if I've got 10-year-old cows, they're staying in there for 10 years, I've got to add 10% coming back if my average herd age. What replacement rate do you think is pretty typical across the industry, or culling rate? And I'll say if we're maintaining static herd size, replacement rate and culling rate would be similar.
Probably somewhere in that 12 to 15% range. is kind of what I think there's some variation across the country in that, but I think somewhere in that ballpark is probably the average.
Last NAHM's numbers I saw, it was right around that 15% range. So, which means I've got cows, my average age, if they're evenly distributed across that range, if I'm replacing 15%, my average age of my cows is 7. Mm-hmm. So my reality somewhere around 7, and you said the ideal somewhere around 10. So what do I do about this, guys? If Philip says I should be higher and I'm not actually quite as high on my average cow age, any ideas on what I should do to manage cow longevity?
I want to go back to the numbers for a second too, because it kind of depends on your philosophy, I guess, right? Because a lot of people work with heifers, right? And so if you're having good breeding success rate in your heifers, and if you have extra heifers, right? I mean, so I kind of want to keep in mind, like, the average is just that, right? It's the whole herd. And so if some people like working with younger animals, and you find other income streams for older animals, right? And so I don't want somebody to walk away from this podcast and go, well, average age of my herd is 5 or 6, but they've got a very heifer-heavy philosophy, right? And that's okay.
And it depends when your culls have a different value, right? If they
sure,
depending on if they come out of the herd pretty early, they've got a different value than in Philip's scenario. I've got maybe a 12-year-old cow, and she doesn't have quite she's not going to be probably put back into a new herd.
Well, and I mean, that optimum, we say longevity, but that optimum may change based on where I'm at in the cattle cycle. Because if like right now prices are high, but at some point here we're going to start to rebuild the cow herd and prices are going to come back down. So I want to have some, be thinking about replacing a lot of those older cows going through the low period, because now they're going to hit their prime supposedly when we have the uptick in the cattle cycle, 4 or 5 years from now. And so that optimum, I think, is not necessarily static. It could change.
Yeah, it's hard to guess on the market on which way you're going, but it is. I've seen some people, and we've talked about this a little bit before, where their replacements and culls on the voluntary side are up to the same dollar amount rather than the same number of head, right? To do exactly what you're saying is, I'm going to save a few more heifers when the prices are lower, save a few less when the prices are higher, because they can go on the market. So thank you guys for sharing your input on that. Appreciate the thoughts there on average cow age. Not an easy solution. And appreciate overall. We had a great discussion today, and those discussions are always good when you send in listener questions for us. So you can always send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.